Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about folk culture versus pop culture, popular culture. And we have talked a little bit about culture on several occasions, and most of the time the kinds of things we've been referring to really talk about folk culture. And when we talk about that, we're talking about cultures that are preserving the traditions that they have and their traditional values. They're typically made up of people who want to maintain whatever that traditional lifestyle is. It's often considered old-fashioned or simpler. And sometimes you're going to see a rural group. It's often considered to be cohesive. Many people look at this as being conservative, right? Although in reality, folk cultures don't necessarily have to be conservative in terms of the way we think of conservative, at least in our daily lives nowadays. Conservative just means that they are preserving the traditions. They're typically self-sufficient and fairly homogenous in terms of their customs, right? It doesn't necessarily mean people, but it means customs, okay? And most of the time it's going to be people too. We're talking about strong family or clan structures, and oftentimes they're really highly developed rituals that go with these cultures. Tradition is paramount, and it is oftentimes very hard to change these cultures, okay? And the Amish and the people who live in the Appalachians, right, the Appalachian Mountains, the region we know as Appalachia, the Amish are probably the best example because they are very closed. They hold to very old-fashioned lifestyles. They have very set traditions. They are very family oriented and they don't change. They are really, in terms of the culture itself, it has not changed very little in ever, right? Now, in Appalachia, there is the Appalachian culture, right? And that means different things in slightly different places, but overall you have this general kind of like Appalachian culture. And unlike the Amish, there has been a push for people to understand Appalachian culture, values, traditions, ways of life, because there have been a lot of misconceptions that they're not particularly happy with. And so, interestingly, there has been an opening of that culture to the rest of the world. And so anytime you have an opening, you have an exchange. And so it'll be kind of exciting to see in the future where that goes for them and what the general population gets in terms of cultural exchange. Now, sometimes we think of countries as having folk cultures, right? And so the question becomes, can a country actually have folk values? And so when we think about our own country, one of the things that we always talk about are the traditional American values and what that means. So what are some of the American values, the things that we're known around the world for? Well, equal opportunity. And while that's not always successful, it is something that we're working for all the time, and the majority of people want equal opportunities for everybody, right? Achievement, success, right? We are constantly working, and that goes to the activity and work thing. We're working to be successful so we can have material comforts. And in that, lots of work, hopefully practicality and efficiency. Now, this is one of our values. I'm not sure it's something that we really practice well, but it's definitely one of our values. Progress. America has traditionally been very forward thinking, right, in terms of especially science, although I'm not sure that's still true either, right? But remember, we're the space program, so yay. Anyway, also, one of the biggest things and one of the oldest and what we are founded on is the idea of freedom, that individuals have rights, which is why we are a democracy. People get to participate in the government, and we have a free enterprise, right? We're a capitalist country, which means that people can individually have the right to try and succeed and to make money, to be successful, right? Now, being successful and making money are not always the same thing, you know, but it is one of the measures that we do use to figure out whether people are successful in relation to other people. And you can argue the philosophy of that and the merit of that all, you know, we can argue that all day long. But it is one of the things that we kind of mark as this is success. Now, popular culture is different than folk culture. Popular culture is what's going on right now. It's the trendy thing. It has a very rapid diffusion, okay? It consists largely of people who are conforming, interestingly enough, to changing norms, right? And so things are constantly changing, but people even though they've got this kind of dynamic culture going on, there is a lot of conformity. And even, we've talked about this, even nonconformists are conforming. Most nonconformists are conforming because they're really a subculture. There's a lot of conformity within cultures. Yeah? We have a sorry, let's try that one more time. We have large heterogeneous groups, right? So they're very diverse. We have lots of different people that are all participating in this. And it's often highly individualistic, even though they're groups. Those groups are constantly changing, and people are shifting from one group to another, from one trend to another. And so there's not that close-knit, cohesive structure that we see in folk culture. Okay, and in a lot of cases, in popular culture, the idea of maintaining order within society, civility within society, falls to the police and the army as opposed to religion and family, because oftentimes when you have a really heavy emphasis on pop culture, some of those traditional values, the religious values or the familial standards, do sort of take a back seat. And now, in order to maintain a civilized society, there needs to be an external force that makes that happen, i.e. the police. And there's often a backlash against that, even though it's a necessary thing to maintain order. Yeah. Now, money often becomes, like we were talking about earlier, the measure of success. Money becomes the focus instead of traditional values. And then also, we have folk cultures that are simply being replaced by pop culture. And so instead of having these trends that kind of enhance things and kind of make a richer development, we have the loss of any sort of substrate, any sort of folk cultural substrate in lots of developed countries, and it's starting to be true in many developing nations as well. There is a geographic variation of how pop culture infiltrates various areas, and so it's really going to depend on how accessible that area is, mostly in terms of technology, actually, because social media, television, all the things that we've talked about are the things nowadays that are going to push popular culture. Now, that also means that it spreads a lot faster and to more places. Now, so when we talk about folk versus popular culture, what are the characteristics? Well, folk culture is typically rural. Pop culture is urban. Folk, traditional. Pop, fads and trends. Folk, conservative. Pop, innovative. And again, these terms don't mean what they mean in politics, okay? Conservative just means that it is really stationary, it's not changing a lot. Innovative means that you are making changes. Goods tend to be handmade in folk culture. They tend to be mass-produced in pop culture. Folk culture spreads really slowly, if at all. Pop culture spreads really rapidly, so that means that the distribution of folk culture is smaller, whereas pop culture is larger. Folk cultures oftentimes have a kind of barter economy, whereas pop culture is going to be strictly money. Okay. Which of the following is not an element of popular culture? Large groups of younger people involved, incorporates heterogeneous populations, experiences cultural traits that do not often change, or it's typically urban. Well, pop culture is all about change, and so you have cultural traits that are constantly changing. So C would not be true. The beliefs and practices and objects that are part of everyday traditions are going to be the things that make up pop culture, okay? As you're moving away from folk culture, right? It's going to be mass-produced and mass-consumed, and the culture, the pop culture stuff that's going on, the social media, the trends, all of that, is going to have a huge role in shaping public attitudes towards things and values. And you can see once something comes to the forefront, in the popular kind of mind, it becomes really its own thing, and it starts to take over, and everybody starts looking at that, and that changes from time to time. And this also changes the way that we consume goods in contemporary societies. Now, one of the things, as you know, I love to talk about is food, because I think food is so interesting, and I think we can all agree that food is oftentimes very representative of what's going on in a culture, right? And so look at food in the South. You have barbecue, fried chicken, hamburgers. In the North, your fast food, junk food, is going to be pizza. Well, in the South, you've got well, Southern culture, right? And so barbecue is a way to deal with meats. I mean, we have a very agrarian history, so we've got the chicken. In the North, you have a lot of Italian immigrants, and while pizza itself is not actually a real Italian dish, it is part of that kind of Italian immigrant. It's the innovation for Italian immigrants in the United States. And it only diffused into the South in the 50s, right? And in fast food, for instance, the South has a lot of fast food. We're a car culture, and so fast food comes up as being a really viable option if you're in the car, right? In Mississippi, 57% of restaurants are actually fast food restaurants, and part of that is because of the economic status that you have there. It's a fairly impoverished state. So you have this combination of wanting cheap, quick food you can get in a car. In the Northeast, that's not going to be true. There's not a lot of car situation going on there, right? So most people are walking or taking public transportation, and so a drive-through is less appealing. And typically, standard of living is a little bit higher than in Mississippi. And so you have sit-down restaurants, okay? Now, when we talk about culture of consumption, right? I think fast food is a really good example when we talk about this, right? And so when we start looking at the percentage of restaurant sales in each of these states, you can see how that's distributed. You can see a lot of fast food restaurants here in the Midwest and the South. Actually, a lot in California, when you're still talking about over a third. Then when you start moving up here, you have less than a third, right? But the majority of the nation is over a third to over half, depending on the states. And so, again, we're talking about this quick, right, fast food, this ease of consumption. And I think that that says a lot about where we are in terms of what we're wanting and what we're doing. Okay, if the idea is you are what you consume, one of the things that you want to look at is where are people buying things. Okay, so how many stores do we have? This happens to be Walmart. Okay, so we're looking at the number of Walmart stores by state. And these colors are going to be the number of people per Walmart store, right? And so on the coast, you tend to have fewer of these large mass consumption stores. A lot of times because you don't have the space, number one, in the coastal areas, and two, there are a lot of already established things, right? And the cost of living is a little bit higher, which means that these cheap goods aren't going to make as big an impression as they do in the Midwest and in the South, where the cost of living is cheaper and people make less money, right? And so then a place like Walmart becomes really important for people who are trying to consume goods. Okay? So, right, I just want you to think about what are the big differences, in between all of these states. And it's something that I just want you to think about and what you think are the answers. So placelessness is something that has a tendency to come up when we start talking about consumption. This picture could be anywhere, right? You've got the Wendy's, the Popeyes, you've got Baskin-Robbins, all of these delicious, right? Fast food kind of things. But you could find them anywhere. They're not unique to any particular area, even though they may have sort of a cultural flair, right? They're not unique to any place. You can find them anywhere, right? Here's the oil change place, right? All sorts of things. Okay, this looks like anywhere. So when we start talking about pop culture landscapes, we are talking about places that have placelessness because there is nothing anchoring them. There isn't anything unique that is part of that folk culture. They're usually going to be landscapes of consumption because that is part of pop culture, is heavy, heavy consumption. And you're going to have more leisure landscapes, right? Because as you start talking about being able to consume more, then you probably also maybe have more free time, so you can spend money on things that are not necessary. Yeah. So the culture of consumption inevitably leads to, and this, I put this as a question, but if you really start looking at landfills and trash and, all of the things that arise from consumption, you start to have this idea of pop culture having a huge effect on the environment, right? Look at all that trash. Look at all this trash. And more. Yeah. So there are some real negative environment impacts. Folk culture operates within the environment. Pop culture does not, right? And so we end up getting uniform landscapes. We take away wild spaces. That results in biodiversity and habitat loss. We have an increased demand for natural resources because you are talking about mass consumption, which leads to depletion of resources and extinction of species. We also tend to use those resources inefficiently. A lot of pollution because of the waste. Okay. Now, folk culture can also negatively impact the environment, but it usually has a much smaller footprint. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about mass media, because mass media is the driver of pop culture. 95% of all homes in the United States have at least one television, more than actually have a landline telephone service. Watching television actually is a hobby for some people. About a quarter of Americans say that is how they spend their evenings, watching TV. And if you think about how much TV you personally watch, it would be interesting to count that up. The average person consumes some form of media over 70 hours per week. Okay, that's more time than they actually spend in school or at work or with their families. And that could be any number of things. It could be the internet, it could be television, it could be your phone, not used as a telephone, right? Used as a smartphone, whatever. Now, which of the following is not going to be an effect of the prevalence of mass media? The creation and promulgation of modern myths, the loss of sense of community and family, lives saved due to improved emergency warnings, or with more information comes a greater sense of control and greater sense of calm? Well, TV, mass media, movies, they create and share modern myths. When we talked about myths before, when you have this rise of the mass media, it is easy to become disconnected from other people because you become plugged into the mass media, and there is a loss of a sense of community and family. Now, on the plus side, you can save lives. I mean, you put up that emergency broadcast, and everybody who's watching TV, and that's a lot of people, will know. Now, the downside, though, is think about when the weather people come on and they're like, oh, there's a tornado here, there's a tornado there, there's a tornado there. That doesn't make people feel in control, right? It just gives them more things to worry about. And so more information is not always a way to get the situation under control, especially if you don't have any sort of sense that that information may be true and you have conflicting information and you don't know how to put it together, which is also a huge problem of mass media. Now, there are lots of shows on TV, and you can really watch something about something you want to at any given time of the day, because there are hundreds, thousands probably, channels that you can watch. But it's interesting when you start looking at TV, and I've put this up, it's a popular show in recent past, but younger audiences are less offended by television because the more that it has all of these things that are considered taboo by older generations, younger generations are more accepting. And in some cases, that may not be a good thing. Being more accepting of violence, that's probably not a good thing. Being more accepting of people who are different than what you are used to, that is a good thing, right? Understanding other points of view, understanding where other people are coming from, that's a good thing, right? Becoming desensitized to violence and sex, that's probably a bad thing, right? And profanity, you can feel however you want about that. I'm not going to say anything about that. But anyway, so there's a positive and a negative to those kinds of things. But one thing that mass media definitely does is it allows you to bring other people into your home. right? Whether you're doing that through TV or the internet. And when you look at this, I think this is actually a really cool map because it's how the internet has changed over time. And it's, of course, more widespread now, but I happen to like this particular picture because between 95 and 2005, you have this explosion of internet access and in places that you would never expect, right? I mean, you're looking at North Africa, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, all having access to the internet, maybe not on large scales, but it's great for schools, for instance. A lot of schools end up having probably only one computer, but they've got access. Cell phones, right? You can actually talk to someone else. You can bring someone else into your home and hear them, right? Share ideas with them. Same thing with the internet, but in case of the cell phone, you're actually having a conversation, which, as we know, conversations are good things to have because that's how you share, is you converse, right? Now let's talk a little bit about trade. With more trade, you have more diffusion of pop culture, and really almost all parts of the world are going to be affected by this, and the friction of distance is less. Costs of things go down. It's easier to get things. The downside is, though, that you have things you think you need that you weren't aware of before, and you probably don't need them, but now it's like, oh, I have to have that, right? Now, the nice thing, though, is that you can relocate freely in this big web of trade that you have, and communication really helps that. And we've talked about this before, electronic highway, cyberspace, right? Interwebs, all of those things, really, really great way of really getting more trade partners, and getting ideas out there. So which of the following is not a result of increased trade? Oh, I didn't read them to you. I'm so sorry. Better working conditions globally, need to keep up with the Joneses, exposure to other cultures, or more availability of goods at less cost. Well, we do get cheaper goods. Yeah, we get exposure to other cultures. That's pretty exciting, right? There is that pressure because you're starting to see what other people have that you might want to have that too because you don't want to have less and blah, blah, blah. So there is that competition. That's kind of a negative thing. It does not improve working conditions globally, and oftentimes it actually can cause a decline in working conditions because you have groups who are just sort of pushing out cheap, fast goods, and that's almost never good for workers. So what about the impact of globalization on pop culture? Well, that's kind of an interesting thing. It's definitely a threat to folk cultures everywhere, right? Rising income is going to increase demand for goods, for things, and those things are typically going to be the things that are valued in pop culture, popular culture. Okay, so it can actually lead to a domination and even a dislike of folk culture, and you lose those traditional values. Sometimes that's okay, right? In when you talk about the change in the traditional role of women, expectations, for people that might not be good expectations, right? Like, okay, well, if you grow up here, you're not going to go to college, or if you grow up here, you have to go to college. You can't do anything else, right? Those are not good sort of limits to roles. So that's a good thing. So some of those traditional values are bad. Some of those traditional values, though, are good, and we lose those too. Homogenization, that disappearance of folk culture there really loses a richness. We lose this wonderful diversity and this sharing and these differences, and that is a negative thing. Okay. Now, when we start talking about the disappearance of folk culture, right? We have different elements that will persist, and then we have some elements that disappear pretty quickly. Okay, so here are just some examples. Architecture, and we're going to talk about urban decay in a couple of days, or in a while. And so architecture is one of those things. The actual vernacular regions, like the Deep South, was one of the vernacular regions we've talked about, or we're going to talk about. That is something that's going to persist. Traditional folk medicines, which I'll talk about in a minute, those do. Music, right, is one of the things that's persistent, actually, as well. And you can hear the roots. Rock and roll, I mean, the roots to rock and roll are blues and gospel, right? And you can hear that. Some of it actually is a little bit country, right? So just depends on what you're talking about, but you can see that flow and you keep some of those elements, right? Vanishing elements that vanish quickly are going to be things like fences, barns, interestingly enough, agricultural techniques, because everybody's urbanizing, and so you lose these things associated with farming, and then dances, right? While music may persist, the types of dancing change. All right, so where are some remnants of surviving folk cultures? I'm going to let you look at this, but I think that you can see one of the things that we're looking at when we look at state fair foods is, do we see any of these surviving folk cultures? And in most of the cases, as we've talked about, some of the cases we see a reflection of these ethnic substrates or these surviving folk cultures, either one. And in some cases we don't. Everything's just the same. Everybody's got fried bacon, right? And then traditional medicine is an interesting thing that is really, really persistent. And homeopathy and herbal remedies, that is what you're talking about when you talk about traditional medicine. That can be good, it can be bad. Most of the time it's not healthy because people don't know what they're doing, and herbs are herbal medicines and all of these things, they can really affect you and they can affect other things, and if you don't understand, that's going to be a bad thing. And then in some cases the folk medicines endanger other species, tigers, rhinoceros, right? The illegal wildlife trade is oftentimes to fulfill orders for folk remedies, and so there's some real downsides to traditional medicine. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's something you have to be really careful about. Okay. And there's just ginseng, for example, is a really popular one. You can buy it in the store. And the question is, should you? All right, so just in summary, folk culture is transmitted from person to person. Pop culture is by media. Folk culture is stable, it's conservative, it's traditionalist. Pop culture is constantly changing and innovating. Folk culture is based on community, shared experiences, mutual obligations. Pop culture is based on impersonal relationships, individualism, but not in like when we say rugged individualism, you know, yay us, more like the focus on the individual as opposed to the idea of community. And then in folk culture there are clear-cut social roles that can oftentimes be a bad thing. In popular culture they're flexible, they're vague social roles, so they're constantly changing. That can be a good thing, right? And in folk culture, we're adapted to a particular environment. Popular culture is really urbanized, right? And so it's a placeless thing, okay? So that is it for these notes. They're a little bit longer, sorry. We had to cover a lot. But that's it, and I will see you next time. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for listening.